Power is a dangerous, intoxicating drug, especially when it falls into the hands of those who are desperate to feel superior. We've all seen the videos, the flashing red and blue lights, the shaky cell phone footage, the desperate pleas of someone whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what happens when the bullies in badges pick the wrong target? What happens when the kid they decide to humiliate on a crowded city sidewalk isn't just a statistic, but the key to their absolute and total ruin? You're about to hear a story of profound injustice, a crowd that refused to look away, and a devastating dose of instant, earth-shattering karma that these two officers will never, ever forget. The late morning sun beat down unforgivingly on the bustling pavement of downtown Philadelphia. Deshaun Carter, 17 years old and sweating through the collar of a slightly oversized, thrifted charcoal suit, adjusted his grip on the black, hard-shell case in his right hand. His heart was a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, but not because of the oppressive July heat. Today was the day. In exactly 45 minutes, Deshaun was scheduled to walk into the grand auditorium of the Philadelphia Conservatory of Music and audition for a full-ride scholarship. For a kid from the rougher edges of West Philly, this wasn't just an audition. It was a lifeline. It was the culmination of 10 years of blistered fingers, late-night practices in a cramped apartment, and the unwavering belief of his late mother, who had worked double shifts to rent him his first instrument. But the case Deshaun carried today wasn't a rental. Inside, resting perfectly against crushed burgundy velvet, was a 19th-century French violin, a masterpiece of carved maple and spruce loaned to him for this exact audition by his mentor, an intensely private and highly influential man who had recognized Deshaun's prodigious talent 3 years prior. The instrument was worth more than most houses in Deshaun's neighborhood. He carried it as if he were transporting a fragile, beating heart. Just 3 blocks away from the conservatory, Deshaun paused at the intersection of Broad and Walnut. He took a deep, steadying breath, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He checked his reflection in the mirrored glass of a high-end boutique, straightening his tie. He wanted to look perfect. He wanted to look like he belonged. He didn't notice the black and white patrol cruiser crawling up the avenue. Inside the cruiser sat Officer Richard Gable and Officer Thomas Jenkins. Gable was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man whose career had stalled a decade ago. He was bitter, cynical, and carried a chip on his shoulder the size of a city block. He viewed the city not as a community to protect, but as a hostile territory to dominate. Jenkins, his rookie partner, was fresh out of the academy, young, impressionable, and desperate for Gable's approval. "Check this out, Tommy," Gable muttered, tapping his thick fingers against the steering wheel. He slowed the cruiser, his narrowed eyes fixed on Deshaun. "What do we have here?" Jenkins leaned forward, squinting through the glare of the windshield. "Looks like a kid in a suit, Rick. Probably heading to a job interview or something." Gable scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "A job interview? Look at him. Suit doesn't fit, looking around all nervous. And what's in that heavy-duty black case? Looks like a rifle case to me, or a sword-off. It looks a little short for a rifle, Rick. Maybe it's an instrument?" Jenkins offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Don't be naive, kid," Gable growled, flipping the switch for the light bar. The flashing red and blues illuminated the storefronts. "In this city, you trust your gut. My gut says that kid is moving something he shouldn't be. Let's go make a stop." The cruiser lurched forward, cutting sharply across the intersection and hopping the curb, the front tires screeching against the concrete. They parked at an aggressive angle, deliberately blocking Deshaun's path. Deshaun froze. The sudden wail of the siren, choked off after a second, echoed in his ears. His stomach dropped. Every lesson his mother had taught him about surviving an encounter with the police flashed through his mind. Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully. Do not make sudden movements. Survive. Gable threw his door open, stepping out with his hand resting menacingly on the butt of his holstered service weapon. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his sneer was loud and clear. Jenkins flanked him, looking slightly nervous but trying to mirror his senior partner's aggressive posture. "Hold it right there, buddy," Gable barked, his voice booming over the ambient noise of the city traffic. "Put the case down and keep your hands where I can see them." Deshawn's throat went dry. "Officer, I'm just walking to—" "I didn't ask where you were going," Gable snapped, closing the distance between them. "I said put the damn case on the ground and show me your hands. Now." Pedestrians began to slow down. The casual flow of the city street thickened into a cautious, watching crowd. Businessmen in sharp suits, women carrying shopping bags, and college students with backpacks paused, their eyes darting between the terrified teenager and the aggressively posturing officers. "Sir, please," Deshawn pleaded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. He slowly lowered the case to the pavement, treating it with the utmost care. "It's a violin. I have an audition at the conservatory. I'm running late." Gable let out a loud, mocking laugh. He looked back at Jenkins. "You hear that, Tommy? Mozart here says it's a violin. You play the violin, kid?" "Yes, sir. Since I was 7, Deshawn said, raising his hands slowly to chest level, palms open and empty. "Right. And I'm the King of England," Gable sneered. He stepped up right into Deshawn's personal space. The cop smelled of stale coffee and cheap cologne. "Turn around, hands on the wall." Deshawn felt a hot flush of humiliation burn its way up his neck. There were at least 20 people watching now. He could see a woman in a yellow dress whispering to her friend, her hand over her mouth. He could feel their judgment, their assumptions. "Officer, I don't have any weapons. I have my ID in my breast pocket. My name is Deshawn Carter. If you just let me—" Gable grabbed Deshawn roughly by the shoulder and spun him around, slamming him face first against the hot, brick facade of the boutique. The impact rattled Deshawn's teeth. "I told you to shut your mouth!" Gable yelled, patting Deshawn down with unnecessary force. He kicked Deshawn's legs apart, making him stumble. "You don't give the orders here. I do." Jenkins stood by the violin case, looking uncomfortable. "He's clean, Rick. No weapons on him." "Then let's see what's in the box," Gable said, stepping back and leaving Deshawn pressed against the wall. "Open it." The crowd had swollen to over 40 people. The initial curiosity had morphed into a tense, suffocating atmosphere. Several people had pulled out their smartphones, the red recording lights blinking ominously. Gable noticed the cameras, but instead of backing down, it seemed to fuel his ego. He thrived on the audience. He wanted to show this crowd, and his rookie partner, exactly who owned the streets. "I said open the case, kid," Gable demanded, pointing his nightstick at the black hard-shell box resting on the dirty concrete. Deshawn turned around slowly. Tears of pure, unadulterated frustration pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He would not cry. Not here. Not in front of them. "Officer, please," Deshawn said, his voice cracking slightly. "The pavement is filthy. There's shattered glass and spilled coffee everywhere. The instrument inside is extremely valuable. It's an antique. It's on loan to me. If it gets scratched or exposed to the damp ground—" "I don't give a damn if it's made of solid gold," Gable roared, stepping forward and jabbing his nightstick hard into Deshawn's chest, forcing the boy to take a step back. "You have no right to refuse a lawful order. We have reasonable suspicion that you are transporting illegal contraband. Now get on your knees and open the box, or I will arrest you right now for obstruction, and I'll pry that thing open with a crowbar myself." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. "Hey, take it easy on him," a man in a barista apron yelled from the edge of the curb. "He's just a kid." "Step back and mind your own business," Jenkins shouted, finally finding his voice, trying to control the growing crowd. "Police business. Keep walking." Deshawn looked at his watch. 10:15 a.m. The audition was in 30 minutes. If he got arrested, even if he was cleared later, his dream was dead. The scholarship would go to someone else. His mother's sacrifices would mean nothing. He had no choice. Slowly, agonizingly, Deshawn lowered himself to his knees. The rough concrete immediately snagged the fabric of his suit pants. He reached out with trembling hands and flipped the heavy brass latches of the case. Click, click, click. He opened the lid. There, gleaming in the harsh sunlight, lay the 19th century French violin. Its varnished wood caught the light, a deep, rich amber that seemed to glow from within. The horsehair bow was secured neatly in the lid. Next to the neck of the violin was a thick stack of sheet music, heavily annotated with pencil marks. For a split second, Gable looked surprised. He had expected to see a disassembled AR-15 or tightly wrapped bricks of narcotics. The sheer beauty of the instrument was completely incongruous with his prejudiced narrative. But Gable's pride was a fragile, dangerous thing. He couldn't admit he was wrong. He couldn't lose face in front of the cameras. "Well, well, well," Gable said, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. He nudged the case with the toe of his heavy black boot. Deshawn flinched, terrified the cop would kick it. "Looks like you actually do have a fiddle in there." "It's a violin, sir," Deshawn whispered. "Can I close it now? The humidity?" "I'm not done," Gable said. He knelt down, his knee popping loudly. He reached his thick, unwashed hands into the velvet-lined case. "Please don't touch the strings," Deshawn blurted out, a wave of panic washing over him. "The oils on your skin can ruin them, and the bridge is very fragile." Gable paused, his hand hovering over the delicate instrument. He looked at Deshawn, his eyes dark with malice. "You telling me how to do my job, boy?" Instead of grabbing the violin, Gable shifted his hand and snatched the thick stack of sheet music resting beside it. He stood up abruptly. "Let's see what kind of codes you're carrying," Gable mocked. He began to flip through the pages. Tchaikovsky, Paganini, Bach. The complex musical notations meant nothing to the officer. To him, it was just an opportunity to humiliate. "Looks like a bunch of gibberish to me," Gable said loudly, ensuring the crowd heard him. "You sure this ain't gang communication? Maybe some cipher?" "It's the Tchaikovsky violin concerto in D major," Deshawn said, his voice rising in desperation. "Please, I need those notes. The bowing annotations are specific for my audition." Gable pretended to examine a page closely. Then, with a theatrical sigh, he let his hand drop. "Oops." He released his grip. Dozens of pages of sheet music, months of hard work, careful notes, and Deshawn's only guide for the most complex sections of his performance, fluttered to the ground. The summer breeze immediately caught the loose pages, scattering them across the dirty sidewalk, into a puddle of spilled soda, and out toward the busy street. "No!" Deshawn cried out, the composure he had fought so hard to maintain finally shattering. He scrambled on his hands and knees, ignoring the pain as the concrete tore through his trousers and scraped his skin. He desperately lunged for a piece of paper, heading toward the gutter, his fingers brushing the edge just as it slid into the muck. The crowd erupted. The murmurs turned into outright shouts of anger. "What is wrong with you?" a woman screamed, pushing her way to the front of the crowd. "You did that on purpose, you piece of garbage!" a college student yelled. holding his phone up high to capture everything. Jenkins looked panicked. "Rick, maybe we should let him go. We have no PC to hold him." "Shut up, Tommy," Gable hissed. The crowd's anger didn't make him back down. It made him double down. He felt a furious need to assert his dominance. He looked down at Deshawn, who was frantically trying to wipe a dirty piece of sheet music against his jacket. "Hey," Gable barked, "I didn't say you could move." Deshawn ignored him, reaching for another page near Gable's boot. It was the excuse Gable was waiting for. "He's resisting," he yelled, though Deshawn was on his hands and knees, utterly defenseless. Gable lunged forward, grabbing Deshawn by the collar of his suit jacket and violently jerking him upward. Deshawn choked as the fabric dug into his windpipe. Before the teenager could even process what was happening, Gable spun him around, slammed him face down onto the hood of the hot patrol car, and yanked his arms painfully behind his back. The metallic snick, snick, snick of handcuffs echoing in the air sounded like the death knell of Deshawn's future. "Get your hands off him!" The scream came from the crowd, a collective roar of outrage. The 40 people had swelled to nearly 100. Traffic on Walnut Street was beginning to back up as drivers slowed down to watch the spectacle. Horns blared. The atmosphere was a powder keg, and Officer Gable was striking matches. "Back up! All of you back the hell up!" Jenkins screamed, finally drawing his taser and pointing it at the crowd. His hands were shaking violently. He was out of his depth, terrified of the mob, yet blindly loyal to the toxic authority of his partner. Pinned against the scorching metal of the police cruiser, Deshawn closed his eyes. The heat of the hood was burning his cheek, but he barely felt it over the icy terror gripping his chest. It was over. The audition was in 20 minutes. He was in handcuffs. His sheet music was destroyed. The precious violin lay exposed on the dirty sidewalk, entirely unguarded. "I'm sorry, Mum," he thought, a single tear cutting a track through the dust on his face. "I tried." "You're making a big mistake, kid," Gable sneered, leaning his heavy weight onto Deshawn's back, pressing the air out of his lungs. "You thought you could get smart with me? You thought you could put on a cheap suit and walk around my city like you own it? You're going downtown, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, interfering with a police investigation." He wasn't doing anything. A businessman in a crisp grey suit stepped off the curb, pointing a damning finger at Gable. "I watched the whole thing. You assaulted him." "I'm warning you," Gable growled, unholstering his pepper spray with his free hand and waving it in an arc toward the businessman. "Interfere with an arrest and you're going in the back of the car with him." The crowd surged slightly, a wave of anger pushing against the invisible barrier of police authority. People were dialing 911, demanding a supervisor, screaming badge numbers into their phones. The noise was deafening, but across the street, shielded from the immediate chaos by soundproof glass and heavy velvet curtains, sat the city's elite. Le Petit Cheval was the most exclusive French bistro in Philadelphia, a place where reservations were made months in advance and multi-million-dollar deals were struck over truffles and caviar. Sitting at a prime corner booth by the window was Judge Harrison Caldwell. Judge Caldwell was a titan of the Pennsylvania legal system. A former civil rights attorney who had taken on the city and won dozens of times before being appointed to the federal bench, he was a man of immense power, impeccable reputation, and zero tolerance for corruption. He was also a man who had secretly paid Deshawn Carter's rent for the last 3 years, bought him groceries, and secured the 19th century violin that was currently sitting on the dirty pavement. Deshawn wasn't just a charity case to the judge. He was the son Caldwell never had. Sitting across from Judge Caldwell, nursing a sparkling water, was Raymond Sterling, the chief of police for the city of Philadelphia. They were having their quarterly lunch, discussing police reform and community outreach over roasted duck. "I'm telling you, Harrison," Chief Sterling was saying, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "We've purged a lot of the bad apples. The culture is changing. It takes time. But my officers know that I will not tolerate the kind of street justice cowboy nonsense we saw in the 90s. Judge Caldwell was about to respond when his eyes drifted past the chief's shoulder, looking out the massive bay window. His brow furrowed. "Raymond," Caldwell said, his deep, resonant voice suddenly dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "What is happening across the street?" Chief Sterling turned in his chair. He saw the crowd. He saw the flashing lights of the cruiser. He saw Officer Jenkins pointing a taser at civilians. But Judge Caldwell didn't see the crowd. His eyes were locked on the small, black, hard-shell case resting open on the pavement. He recognized the crushed burgundy velvet. He recognized the wood of the instrument. Then he saw the boy in the charcoal suit, pinned face down on the hood of the police car, his arms twisted brutally behind his back by a heavy-set officer. The color drained from Judge Caldwell's face, instantly replaced by a terrifying, cold fury. He didn't say a word. He didn't excuse himself. He simply stood up, threw his linen napkin onto the table, and marched toward the exit of the restaurant. Chief Sterling, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, dropped a $100 bill on the table and hurried after the judge. "Harrison! Harrison! Wait! Let me call dispatch! Find out what's going on!" Caldwell pushed open the heavy brass doors of the bistro, stepping out into the suffocating July heat. The roar of the crowd hit them instantly. "He's bleeding!" a woman was screaming. Gable had wrenched Deshawn's arms up higher, trying to force him into the back of the cruiser. "Stop fighting or I'll break your damn arm!" Gable shouted, completely oblivious to the hurricane that was walking across the street toward him. Judge Caldwell didn't run. Men of his stature didn't need to run. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate purpose. His eyes were locked on Officer Gable. Chief Sterling jogged to keep up, pulling his phone from his belt clip. As they reached the edge of the crowd, people instinctively parted. There was something about the sheer, radiating authority of the two men, the immaculate tailoring of Caldwell's suit, the gold stars glinting on Sterling's uniform collar, that silenced the onlookers in their immediate vicinity. The shouting died down, rippling outward like a wave, until the only sound was Gable's heavy breathing and Deshawn's muffled sobs. Gable, sensing the sudden drop in noise, paused. He turned his head, a smug, victorious look still plastered across his sweaty face. He expected to see another patrol car arriving for backup. Instead, he saw a tall, grey-haired man in a bespoke suit standing 3 feet away, staring at him with a gaze that could shatter glass. And right behind him, staring at Gable with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, was the chief of police. Gable's smirk vanished. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His thick hands, which had been ruthlessly twisting Deshawn's wrists just seconds before, suddenly went limp. Judge Harrison Caldwell looked down at the $50,000 violin sitting on the filthy concrete. He looked at the scattered sheet music blowing in the gutter. Then he looked into Officer Gable's wide, terrified eyes. "Take your hands off my son," the judge whispered. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Before I take them from you." The silence that fell over the intersection of Broad and Walnut was heavier than the suffocating July humidity. Officer Richard Gable, a man who had spent 20 years feeding his ego by terrorizing those he deemed powerless, was suddenly paralyzed. His brain, slow to process anything outside of his own prejudiced narrative, short-circuited. He stared at Judge Harrison Caldwell. He knew that face. Every cop in Philadelphia knew that face. Caldwell was the federal judge who had recently overseen the sweeping consent decree against the city's police department, a man who routinely held corrupt officers in contempt and dismantled their careers with a stroke of his pen. And standing right behind the judge, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the summer sun, was Chief of Police Raymond Sterling. "Judge Caldwell, Gable stammered, his voice entirely devoid of its earlier booming arrogance. It sounded thin, reedy, like a deflating balloon. "We had reasonable suspicion. The suspect, Chief Sterling roared, stepping out from behind Caldwell. The chief's face was a mask of absolute, unbridled fury. "You have a child pinned to the hood of a scorching vehicle over a violin, Gable. I saw the whole thing from the window across the street. I watched you assault him." Jenkins, the rookie, let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. He fumbled frantically with his taser, shoving it back into its holster as if the weapon were suddenly made of molten iron. "Chief Sterling, sir. I told him we should let him go. I swear I did, sir." "Shut your mouth, Jenkins," Sterling barked, his eyes blazing. "You stood there and pointed a weapon at unarmed civilians. You're just as guilty. Handcuff Keys, Gable, right now." Gable's hands were shaking so violently that he could barely unclip his keyring from his duty belt. He dropped them twice on the concrete. The crowd, realizing the massive shift in the power dynamic, began to cheer and jeer. "Not so tough now, are you, piggy?" a teenager shouted from the front row of onlookers. "Get his badge number," a woman yelled, her phone still recording every agonizing second of Gable's humiliation. "Make him famous." Judge Caldwell didn't wait for Gable to retrieve the keys. He stepped forward, shoved the heavy-set officer aside with surprising force, and reached for the cuffs himself, snatching the keys from Gable's trembling fingers. "Deshawn," Caldwell said, his voice instantly softening as he unlocked the heavy steel bracelets. "Are you all right, son? Talk to me." Deshawn slowly pushed himself off the hood of the cruiser. His charcoal suit was ruined, the knees torn open, the fabric stained with dirt and sweat. His wrists were already bruising a deep, ugly purple. He was shaking uncontrollably, gasping for air as the adrenaline crash hit him hard. "Judge," Deshawn choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "My music. He threw my music in the street. And the violin. The bridge." Caldwell turned his head slowly. He looked at the antique violin sitting exposed on the dirty pavement, and then at the scattered sheets of Tchaikovsky blowing toward the storm drain. When he turned his gaze back to Gable, the officer visibly flinched. "You," Caldwell pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Gable. "You are going to pick up every single piece of that paper. If one page is missing, if one sheet goes down that drain, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your miserable life paying for it." "Yes, Your Honor," Gable whispered, his face flushed with a sickening mix of fear and public shame. The 20-year veteran, the bully of the block, dropped to his hands and knees in front of 100 cheering civilians and began scrambling across the filthy pavement, frantically chasing after the dirty sheets of music. Chief Sterling stepped up to Caldwell, his expression deeply apologetic. "Harrison, I cannot express how—" "Save it, Raymond," Caldwell cut him off, his tone ice-cold. He brushed the dirt off Deshawn's shoulders. "You told me you purged the bad apples. It looks like the rot goes right to the core. I expect badges on your desk by noon, or I am calling the Department of Justice myself." "You'll have them," Sterling promised, his jaw set. He turned to Jenkins, who was crying silently. "Get in the car, Jenkins. Both of you, get in the back of the damn car. You're done." Caldwell looked at his gold pocket watch. 10:35 a.m. "Deshawn, look at me," Caldwell said, grasping the boy's shoulders firmly. "You have 10 minutes. The conservatory panel will not wait." "I can't," Deshawn sobbed, looking down at his torn clothes and bleeding hands. "Look at me, Judge. I'm a mess. I don't have my music. I can't do it." "Yes, you can," Caldwell said fiercely. He walked over to the velvet case, carefully inspecting the violin before securing it and snapping the brass latches shut. He handed the case to Deshawn. "You have played that concerto in my living room 100 times from memory. You do not need the paper. You do not need a perfect suit. You are a musician, Deshawn. Show them what that means. Do not let this ignorant thug steal your future." Deshawn took a deep, shuddering breath. He wiped his face with the back of his bruised wrist, leaving a smear of dirt across his cheek. He looked at the crowd, who had fallen silent, watching the exchange. He looked at Gable, who was currently fishing a soggy piece of sheet music out of a puddle, looking utterly pathetic. "Okay," Deshawn whispered, his grip tightening on the handle of the case. "Okay, let's go." The grand auditorium of the Philadelphia Conservatory of Music was a cavernous space of acoustic perfection, paneled in rich mahogany and bathed in warm, golden light. At the center of the vast stage stood a single wooden chair and a music stand. In the front row of the empty, velvet-lined seats sat a panel of 3 distinguished judges, their faces buried in clipboards. Dr. Alastair Reed, the head of the string department, tapped his fountain pen impatiently against his watch. 10:46 a.m. "It appears Mr. Carter is a no-show," Dr. Reed sighed, shaking his head. "A pity. His preliminary tapes were quite extraordinary. But punctuality is the foundation of professionalism. Let us move on to the next." The heavy oak doors at the back of the auditorium slammed open with a deafening bang that echoed through the hall. The judges jumped in their seats, twisting around. Down the center aisle walked Deshawn Carter. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. His charcoal suit jacket was torn at the shoulder. His trousers were ripped at the knees, exposing bloody, raw scrapes. His knuckles were bruised, and a streak of grime cut across his face. He looked like he had just survived a war zone, not a morning commute. Beside him walked Judge Harrison Caldwell, looking as immaculate and formidable as ever, radiating an intense, silent authority. "Apologies for the delay, Dr. Reed." Caldwell's voice boomed through the hall, requiring no microphone. Mr. Carter experienced a severe, unforeseen obstacle on his way here, but he is ready. Dr. Reed stared in shock at the battered teenager. "My word, boy, do you need a doctor? We can reschedule." "No, sir," Deshawn said. His voice was raspy, but it was surprisingly steady. The terror of the street had burned away, leaving behind a raw, blinding adrenaline. "I want to play." He walked onto the stage. He didn't bother opening the music stand. He placed the black case on the floor, unlatched it, and lifted the antique French violin. He checked the tuning. His hands were shaking, but the moment the wood rested beneath his chin, a profound transformation occurred. The shaking stopped. The bruised wrists found their perfect, familiar angles. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he didn't see the beautiful hall. He saw Gable's sneering face. He felt the burning metal of the police cruiser. He felt the terrifying, crushing weight of powerlessness. Deshawn raised the bow, and then he struck the strings. The opening chords of Tchaikovsky's violin concerto in D major exploded into the auditorium. It wasn't just played, it was unleashed. Every ounce of fear, every drop of humiliation, every shred of furious, desperate hope that Deshawn had felt over the last 45 minutes was poured into the horsehair and the strings. The music was aggressive, bleeding with emotion, yet technically flawless. He played the complex, frantic runs with a blistering speed that made Dr. Reed drop his pen. He played the slow, mournful adagio with such profound, weeping sorrow that the female judge beside Reed visibly wiped a tear from her eye. Deshawn wasn't just playing notes. He was telling the story of his morning. He was taking the trauma that had been inflicted upon him and transforming it into something breathtakingly beautiful. When he finally slashed the bow across the strings for the final chord, the silence that followed was absolute. Deshawn stood on the stage, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his chin, the violin lowered to his side. For 10 seconds, nobody breathed. Then, Judge Caldwell stood up and began to clap. Slowly, the 3 judges rose to their feet, joining him. It wasn't polite applause. It was a thunderous, standing ovation for a kid who had just delivered the performance of a lifetime. Miles away, in the harsh, fluorescent-lit basement of the 12th District Precinct, there was no applause. Officer Richard Gable sat slumped in a metal chair in an interrogation room. His uniform was stained with street water and dirt from crawling on the pavement. His duty belt, his weapon, and his badge had been stripped from him. He stared at his empty hands, the reality of his situation slowly crushing the breath out of him. The door clicked open. Chief Sterling walked in, followed by 2 stern-faced detectives from Internal Affairs. Sterling slammed a tablet onto the metal table in front of Gable. On the screen was a video, already boasting hundreds of thousands of views. It was the footage taken by the woman in the crowd. It showed every second of the encounter, the unprovoked aggression, the destruction of the sheet music, the brutal takedown of a compliant teenager, and finally, the pathetic sight of Gable crawling on the ground under the furious gaze of a federal judge. "It's gone national, Gable," Sterling said, his voice quiet and completely devoid of sympathy. "The mayor has called me 3 times. The district attorney is drafting civil rights violation charges as we speak. We're also auditing every single arrest you've made in the last 10 years. Gable looked up, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. "Chief, please. I have 20 years on the force. My pension. My family. I made a mistake." The kid looked suspicious. "The kid was a violin prodigy on his way to an audition. You ignorant fool," Sterling hissed, leaning over the table. "You targeted him because of how he looked and where he was walking. You abused your power. And you did it in front of the one man in this city who has the power to utterly destroy you." Sterling straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. "You're not just fired, Richard," Sterling said coldly. "You're going to prison, and I am going to personally make sure the district attorney pursues the maximum sentence. Your career as a bully is over." As Sterling walked out of the room, leaving Gable to the mercy of Internal Affairs, the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed in the small room, finalizing the dramatic, devastating reversal of fortune. Gable buried his face in his hands, realizing too late that the power he had wielded so recklessly had just become the instrument of his own absolute destruction. The video didn't just go viral. It ignited a cultural firestorm. Within 24 hours, the shaky cell phone footage of Officer Richard Gable brutalizing a 17-year-old violin prodigy in a torn charcoal suit had dominated every major news network in the country. It was on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, looping continuously on CNN, and being dissected frame by frame on social media by millions of furious viewers. The hashtag Justice for Deshawn trended globally, a digital tidal wave of outrage demanding immediate and severe accountability. For Richard Gable, the descent into absolute ruin was dizzying and terrifyingly swift. The morning after the incident, Gable woke up not to the sound of his alarm clock, but to the blinding glare of news cameras parked on the lawn of his suburban home. Reporters shouted questions through bullhorns, demanding to know why he had assaulted an innocent child. His wife, horrified by the footage she had seen on the evening news and unable to bear the crippling public shame, packed a suitcase, took their 2 children, and drove to her sister's house in New Jersey before the sun even fully rose. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to a printed screenshot of Gable forcing Deshawn onto the hood of the cruiser, but the domestic fallout was merely the opening act of his nightmare. At 10 a.m., the district attorney of Philadelphia held a live, televised press conference. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Chief Raymond Sterling and Mayor Thomas Higgins, the DA looked directly into the cameras with a grim, uncompromising expression. "This morning, my office has filed formal charges against former police officer Richard Gable," the DA announced, his voice echoing through the packed press briefing room. "These charges include aggravated assault, false imprisonment, official oppression, and the severe deprivation of civil rights under the color of law. We are not offering a plea deal. We are seeking the maximum allowable sentence. The badge is a symbol of public trust, not a license to terrorize our youth." The absolute twist of the knife, however, came an hour later. The Fraternal Order of Police, the immensely powerful union that traditionally shielded officers from legal and administrative blowback, released a terse, two-sentence statement. Because of the irrefutable video evidence, and under intense, behind-the-scenes pressure from Judge Harrison Caldwell and federal oversight committees, the union publicly disavowed Gable. They announced they would not provide him with legal representation or financial support. Gable was entirely, terrifyingly alone. He was forced to hire a cut-rate defense attorney using his rapidly dwindling personal savings. Meanwhile, the legal cavalry had arrived for Deshawn Carter, and it was a force of nature. Recognizing the gravity of the civil rights violation, renowned civil rights attorney Ben Crump formally joined Deshawn's legal team pro bono. Crump, a man whose name struck fear into corrupt municipal departments nationwide, flew into Philadelphia and immediately filed a massive federal civil lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Richard Gable as an individual. "We are not just here to ask for apologies," Crump thundered on the steps of the federal courthouse, wrapping a protective arm around a quiet, newly suited Deshawn. "We are here to dismantle the very system that allowed a man like Richard Gable to wear a badge for 20 years. We will make it so economically devastating for the city to employ bullies that they will have no choice but to permanently clean house." The criminal trial of Richard Gable began 6 months later, in the dead of winter. The courtroom was packed every single day. Gable, sitting at the defense table, looked a decade older. He had lost 30 pounds. His once intimidating, bullish physique had withered. His cheap suit hung loosely on his frame, a stark and ironic contrast to the way he had mocked Deshawn's clothing on the day of the assault. The prosecution's case was a masterclass in legal dismantling, but the true fatal blow came from inside Gable's own cruiser. Officer Thomas Jenkins, terrified of facing federal prison time, had accepted a cooperation agreement. He took the witness stand, refusing to make eye contact with his former mentor. But it wasn't just his testimony that buried Gable. It was the digital evidence Jenkins provided. "Officer Jenkins," the prosecuting attorney asked, pacing before the jury box. "On the morning of July 14th, before you initiated the stop on Deshawn Carter, what was the conversation inside the patrol vehicle?" "Objection. Hearsay," Gable's exhausted lawyer barked. "Overruled," the judge stated flatly. "The witness may answer." Jenkins swallowed hard, his microphone amplifying his nervous breathing. "Officer Gable told me to look at the kid. He said—" Jenkins paused, looking down at his trembling hands. He said, "Look at this punk playing dress-up. Probably stole that case. Let's ruin his morning and see if he cries." A collective gasp swept through the gallery, but the prosecutor wasn't finished. "And do you have proof of this statement?" "Mr. Jenkins?" "Yes, sir," Jenkins whispered. Officer Gable thought he had disabled the dashcam audio recording system earlier that week because he didn't like Internal Affairs listening to our conversations. But he only disconnected the primary wire. The secondary backup system was still recording to the hard drive. When the prosecution played the crystal-clear audio recording of Gable's cruel, premeditated malice for the courtroom, Gable closed his eyes. The sheer, overwhelming silence from the jury box felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. It was the sound of absolute guilt. It was the sound of a man whose arrogance had finally, irrevocably trapped him. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson read the verdict, guilty on all counts, Gable didn't even flinch. He just stared blankly at the polished wooden table. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Because he had been convicted of a felony committed while in uniform, his city pension, the safety net he had spent 20 years building, was permanently revoked. He lost his freedom, his family, his money, and his pride. The karma was absolute, merciless, and terrifyingly swift. While Richard Gable's life was dismantled brick by brick, Deshaun Carter's life was being rebuilt into a masterpiece. 2 weeks after the horrific incident on Broad Street, an official letter with the embossed seal of the Philadelphia Conservatory of Music arrived at the cramped West Philly apartment Deshaun shared with his aunt. Deshaun had stared at the thick envelope for 10 minutes before his trembling fingers finally tore it open. Inside was an acceptance letter, but it was far more than just an offer of admission. Dr. Alistair Reed, deeply moved by Deshaun's astonishing resilience and generational talent, had personally lobbied the board of directors. Deshaun was awarded the prestigious Maestro's Fellowship, a full-ride, unconditional scholarship covering tuition, room, board, and a generous living stipend. Furthermore, the civil lawsuit orchestrated by Ben Crump and guided by Judge Caldwell reached a historic, multi-million-dollar settlement with the city just months before Gable's criminal trial concluded. The sheer size of the payout sent shockwaves through the municipal government, triggering an immediate, sweeping overhaul of the police department's hiring, psychological screening, and disciplinary protocols. Chief Sterling was forced into early retirement, and a new, reform-minded commissioner was brought in to clean up the cultural rot. With the settlement funds, Deshaun did exactly what his late mother had always dreamed of. He moved his aunt out of their deteriorating neighborhood and bought a beautiful, secure home in the quiet suburbs, complete with a soundproofed music studio on the second floor. He didn't let the money or the sudden national fame distract him. If anything, the trauma of that July morning had forged his discipline into pure steel. He immersed himself completely in his studies at the conservatory. He practiced until his fingers bled, and then he'd tape them up and practiced some more. He poured every memory of fear, every ounce of grief for his mother, and every spark of triumph into the strings of his violin. 2 years passed. It was a crisp, clear December evening in Philadelphia. The magnificent glass dome of the Kimmel Center for the Performing Arts glowed like a beacon against the winter sky. Inside, the grand concert hall was packed to absolute capacity. 3,000 people, dressed in their finest evening wear, sat in hushed, expectant silence. In the center of the VIP balcony, sitting upright and immensely proud, was Judge Harrison Caldwell. Beside him sat Ben Crump, smiling warmly. Down on the stage, the Philadelphia Orchestra, a world-renowned ensemble of 90 master musicians, sat with their instruments at the ready. The conductor raised his baton, but the spotlight wasn't on him. The spotlight was entirely focused on the young man standing at the front of the stage. Deshaun Carter, now 19 years old, looked entirely transformed. He wore a perfectly tailored, midnight blue tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. He stood tall, his shoulders relaxed, exuding a quiet, profound confidence that commanded the massive room. In his left hand, he held his own instrument, a breathtaking, custom-crafted Italian violin, purchased with his settlement, symbolizing his independence and his victory. As the conductor brought the baton down, the orchestra swelled, introducing the dramatic, sweeping opening of the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. When Deshawn brought his bow to the strings, magic happened. He didn't just play the music, he commanded it. He wove a spell over the 3,000 people in the audience. The notes flew from his fingers with a blistering, passionate intensity, yet carried a deep, soulful maturity that only comes from having walked through the fire and emerged unburned. He was brilliant. He was undeniable. He was a living testament to the fact that raw talent and unyielding perseverance will always, eventually, outshine the darkness of ignorance and hate. When the final, triumphant chord echoed through the magnificent hall, the reaction was instantaneous. 3,000 people leapt to their feet, the applause deafening, a roaring wave of admiration and respect. Flowers were thrown onto the stage. Deshawn lowered his bow, a radiant, genuine smile breaking across his face. He looked up at the balcony, locking eyes with Judge Caldwell, and offered a deep, grateful bow. 50 miles away, in the cold, grey confines of SCI Phoenix, a maximum security state prison, the lights were harsh and unforgiving. In a small concrete recreation room that smelled of industrial bleach and stale sweat, a heavy-set man in an orange jumpsuit sat hunched in a plastic chair. His hair was thinning and entirely grey. His face was lined with deep, permanent scowls of regret and bitterness. Former Officer Richard Gable stared blankly at the small, cage-enclosed television mounted high in the corner of the room. The local PBS station was broadcasting the Winter Gala live from the Kimmel Center. The camera panned across the stage, zooming in for a tight, high-definition close-up of Deshawn Carter. The teenager was beaming, holding his magnificent violin high in the air, accepting the thundering adoration of the city's elite. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, Deshawn Carter, Prodigy, Triumphs in Winter Solo. Gable sat in the deafening, oppressive silence of his prison reality, watching the boy he had tried so desperately to conquer the world. He couldn't look away. He watched the standing ovation. He watched the sheer, unadulterated joy on Deshawn's face. Every single cheer from the television crowd felt like a physical blow to Gable's chest. The contrast was absolute. The boy he had pushed to the filthy pavement was now standing on the highest peak of success, beloved and celebrated, and the man who had worn the badge, who had thought himself an untouchable king of the streets, was nothing more than a forgotten inmate in a concrete box, stripped of his name, his power, and his future. Karma hadn't just knocked on Richard Gable's door, it had kicked it off the hinges and burned the house to the ground. And as Gable sat alone in the cold fluorescent light, the beautiful, haunting echoes of a violin playing in his memory, he finally realized the most devastating truth of all. He had entirely brought this upon himself. Power, when abused, is a boomerang. It may feel exhilarating when you throw it out into the world, but it will always circle back, and it will strike you with 10 times the force you put into it. The story of Deshawn Carter and Officer Richard Gable is a powerful, real-world reminder that true strength isn't found in a badge, a gun, or the ability to intimidate those who are vulnerable. True strength is found in resilience, in the pursuit of excellence, and in the courage to stand back up when the world tries to force you to your knees. Deshawn didn't fight back with his fists. He fought back with his brilliance, his dignity, and a community that refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. If this story of profound karma and absolute triumph moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps push these important narratives out to more people. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that bullies never win in the end. And be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next incredible story of justice served. Leave a comment down below. What would you have done if you were in that crowd? We'll see you in the next one.